the case may be. My name is Blaine Lewis. I am head of the Indonesia Project. This is the 56th year of the Indonesia Project, which is supported by the Crawford School of Public Policy at ANU, and also the Government Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. I'd like to thank both Crawford, ANU, and DFAT for their continued support. Welcome to the Indonesia Project Conference, Economic Dimensions of COVID-19 in Indonesia, Responding to the Crisis. As many of you will know, this is a substitute for our usual Indonesia update, which has been postponed for obvious reasons. Thanks to all of you who have registered for the conference already. I've just learned that we have about 1,800 people who have registered, so our reach is pretty good on the conference. That's a very good thing. Thank you very much to everybody. We've got a solid program organized for you over the next 4 days. I hope you'll all be able to join as many of those days as possible. You can download the full program for the conference from the Indonesia Project website. I'd like to begin the conference by introducing Professor Brian Schmidt. Brian is the Vice-Chancellor and President of Australian National University, position he has held since January of 2016. Brian is an astrophysicist by training. His PhD is from Harvard. As many of you are aware, Brian won the Nobel Prize in Physics in 2011. Brian is a fellow of the Australian Academy of Science, the United States Academy of Science, and the Royal Society, and a companion of the Order of Australia. Brian, thank you very much for being with us. Over to you.
Hello and welcome. My name is Professor Brian Schmidt, Vice-Chancellor of the Australian National University, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to this conference hosted by the ANU Indonesia Project. Before we begin today, I would like to acknowledge and celebrate the first Australians on whose traditional lands and airwaves we all are meeting today, and pay my respects to elders past and present. Our student community is made up of people from all over the globe, including many from Indonesia. ANU has produced some fantastic Indonesian alumni, some of who will be joining you a little later in this conference. And we look forward to welcoming many more Indonesian students to ANU on their path to their dream, no matter what it is, noting it's a little challenging right now in the COVID-19 era. In addition to our connection through our student cohort, a large number of our scholars have had particular focus and interest in Indonesia. We have the largest concentration of scholars working on Indonesia anywhere in the world outside of the country itself. And the ANU Indonesia Project is a leading international center of research and graduate training on the society and economy of Indonesia. There's not many things that are been going longer than me, but the Indonesia Project is 3 years older than me. But I see Hal Hill here. It's not 3 years older than Hal. Yes. So this conference is going to focus on the economic dimensions of COVID-19 in Indonesia. This includes considering both the macro and microeconomic effects, as well as short and long-term impacts. It constitutes the first comprehensive analysis of Indonesia's response to the crisis from an economic perspective. And this is, therefore, a significant initiative. I would very much like to thank the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade for their continued support of the ANU Indonesia Project and of the university more broadly. We aim to be great partners, and we really think we do some of our best work with the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Important events such as these would simply not be able to happen without DFAT's contribution. And so we look forward to continuing to work together on this and other things going forward. As well as the connection with DFAT, the conference also illustrates the strong relationship between the ANU Indonesian Project and the government of Indonesia. I would like to thank His Excellency, Mr. Gary Quinlan, Australia's ambassador to Indonesia, for agreeing to speak today. But I also like to acknowledge Professor Bodiono, the former Vice President of Indonesia, Dr. Chadi Basri, former Minister of Finance and ANU alumnus, and Professor Ari Kunchoro, Rector of the University of Indonesia. Thank you all for agreeing to speak over the coming 4 days. It is an honor to have all of these people and everyone else amongst us. I am confident that through this conference, some very valuable insights on Indonesia's economic response to the pandemic will eventuate. And of course, what we hope is that will create meaningful change and meaningful opportunity so that we can land Indonesia and the Australian economy, as well as the whole region, in a good place in the post-COVID-19 world. So I look forward to hearing about the discussions that are had, and I thank you and look forward to enjoying the conference, all of you, and me hearing about it. Back over to you, Bud.
Directly to.
Sorry, I'm Gary Quinlan, the Australian Ambassador in Indonesia, and I want to say good afternoon to all the colleagues here, and selamat pagi to all our colleagues across Indonesia, including in particular, of course, Professor Bordadiano and his other distinguished colleagues, all of whom know a great deal about Australia, the good and the bad, and we're pleased that they're able to participate today as well. Obviously, I want to thank Brian Schmidt, the Vice-Chancellor of this great national institution at ANU, an institution which has been instrumental over the decades in this country in deepening and improving public debate, and has made a very significant contribution to what were originally pioneering efforts in outreach from Australia and this institution, but more broadly into our own region, the neighbourhood, and in producing some of the best analysis of what's actually happening on Indonesia and beyond, of course, available anywhere. We owe ANU a big thank you for that, and the contribution they have made and continue to make in that regard. The Indonesia project was established in 1965, and I've been around quite a while myself, so I've seen some of this evolve over the years and evolve to get better and better and stronger and stronger. The fact that there are 1,800 registrants today speaks for itself. And as Professor Schmidt has just said, this university has the best constellation, largest and best, of Indonesianists anywhere in the world. And that also, of course, speaks for itself. More than, however, just the constellation who are here in Canberra, there is also the incredible institutional network that's been developed into Indonesia from this institution and capturing other parts of the Australian ethos as well. And also, I want to acknowledge the work that's been done in developing a very strong cohort of younger generation Indonesianists, both in Australia but in Indonesia as well, and between the two countries, who are going to help set the future of the relations between both of us. Now, all of that obviously is to the good, but I also want to acknowledge another very distinctive contribution, and that is the way in which the Indonesia project and ANU have helped frame public policy debate in Indonesia itself, as Indonesia has evolved over the decades to have to face the same sorts of challenges and issues in policy that all of us in government have to face in our own countries. And it's through the debate, which is based, of course, on evidence, and through the expert advice that's been provided, that we have the success of this project. This is a comparative advantage, in fact, a competitive advantage, which we must, as a nation, and I'm speaking to my own countrymen and women in this regard, we must never lose that comparative advantage. And I'd encourage Professor Schmidt, who's got a lot of thinking that he was giving to how he can leverage off this project more broadly for ANU's relationship and presence with Indonesia into the future. The world's disrupted by COVID, but I encourage you to continue to think along those lines as to whatever might be able to be done. Look, this annual update conference, of course, has become quite totemic in the relationship and in the calendars of government people, university people, media people, NGOs and the private sector, and that's a great thing. It can be controversial at times, another good thing. It depends on the subject of the day, but it's all about debate based on evidence and the exchange of different points of view about whatever that subject is. DFAT has supported the Indonesia project since the 1980s, and a week ago we recommitted to funding. Now, the next 5 days or the next few days are obviously going to represent, I think, as Professor Schmidt said, the first sort of comprehensive look at the economic impact of COVID-19 in Indonesia and on the economy and the government's response to it. I won't anticipate that discussion, and I'm not qualified to. I'm very much a price taker in many of these debates. I hope an observant one, but that's for others to judge. So I'm actually here to learn. Like most governments, Indonesian government has obviously been learning as COVID has wreaked its devastation. You only have to look at the changing growth forecasts from Indonesian government, but also other institutions and agencies and world agencies about Indonesia to see how uncertain and fast changing economic conditions and the public health threat are. The latest forecasts from various agencies range from a 3.6% contraction over a year to a 1.4% expansion. So there's quite a lot of room there in those kind of estimates to make assessments. Well, how do you arrive at these calculations and what might it actually mean? I will be very interested, of course, to see the assessments of the way back to recovery, and the Australian government will be very interested to read and learn more about that as well. We've had a lot of regular exchange between the Prime Minister and the President, regularly talk to each other. Treasurer Frydenberg and Sri Mulyani regularly talk to each other. The two foreign ministers, of course, the two defence ministers, but also others, including some of our more functional ministers who've got particular responsibilities of reaching out and talking to each other. There are obvious questions we're all facing. What's the right balance between public health and economic reopening? And when is the point at which you can throw one lever more than the other? And what's the interrelationship between them? How effective are the stimulus packages? How effective is social protection, which is so vital during the transition back to recovery? Can the government sustain an intelligent infrastructure program? What's the role of the 12 designated SOEs in the road to recovery, and what efforts need support within the private sector? How confident are we in the monetary policy settings? All these kind of issues. And also another interesting issue, will the government of Indonesia take the opportunity to move beyond the stimulus packages and, like many other governments, wrestle with the reality of what kind of longer-term structural reform is needed? So these are just some of the questions I imagine will be looked at. They're hardly original thoughts, but the answers are obviously of interest to everybody. Indonesia's success is obviously vital to Indonesia itself, but equally, it's very vital to the Indo-Pacific region. Other economies are more internationally exposed than Indonesia, more innovative, more foreign investment, greater global capital flows, and so much of Indonesia's economy is domestic. But the health of its economy does matter to the economic health of the whole region. And it matters in underwriting Indonesia's broader strategic weight, which is so vital to the strategic resilience of the Indo-Pacific. We all know that Southeast Asia is at the heart of the defining geostrategic competition and, in fact, geoeconomic competition as well, along the US-China fault line in the Indo-Pacific. COVID-19 has compounded the strategic risks. Shifts in the distribution of power across the region are accelerating. Pressures on rules, norms, institutions are more acute. US-China relations are coming under greater strain, and disinformation, cyber intrusions are threatening sovereignty, including the integrity of our economies and our economic decision-making, and of course the vital infrastructure and the digital economic future. Middle powers like Indonesia and Australia have got a decisive role in stepping up to address all those challenges, and we need to be resilient ourselves to enable us to be able to do that. I want to finish here, and I'm glad you'll be pleased that I'm about to finish, with a few comments on Australia, Indonesia. First of all, we have a resilient relationship. It is not a fragile relationship. And when you look at it over the last few decades, more and more that resilience shows through. And the reason over the last few years I just want to highlight is because of the dramatic change in the Indo-Pacific region, geostrategically, geoeconomically, technological change, ecological change, both Indonesia and Australia have been looking at what does the future mean for each of us? And this is pre-COVID. And the conclusion was the same by both countries. And it was that we needed to be resilient. And how do you achieve resilience? You achieve it with close, resilient partners, because you can do things better in a more magnified way to actually be able to have an impact, make a difference, and help frame your own region. So very deliberate choices have been made by both governments over the last couple of years, brought together with our comprehensive strategic partnership and our closer economic partnership in order to make it all work. Our development cooperation program has pivoted. It's a large one in Indonesia, has pivoted to the COVID response. I mention it because it's a really sophisticated program, and it has made Australia Indonesia's partner of choice on policy and institutional development, resilient economic governance, and in building technical and intellectual capacity. And that brings me back to where I started. This broader role for Australia and the development program, but our relationship aligns very closely with the ANU efforts and the ANU Indonesian project. President Widodo was here in Canberra in February. He addressed the Parliament, only the second Indonesian president to have done so. The last was SBY in 2010. This was the only time President Widodo's been asked to address another country's parliament, by the way. He commented during his speech, and I quote, "Indonesia has no greater friend than Australia." Now, politicians and presidents tend to say these things when they address parliaments, but it helps when they're speaking about a change that actually has happened in bringing us to a new turning point in our relations. This, of course, is as it should be, and I think our Indonesian colleagues will find that you have no better partner as well, and ANU is a very strong part of that contemporary partnership. And I want to say thank you again to ANU, but thank you to all of you who are participating in the next few days. Terima kasih.
Okay, thank you very much, Gary and Brian. Thank you very much for your participation. Really great that you could be here today. Now we'll start the presentations for today's session. We have 3 presentations. I'm going to introduce the authors all at once rather than hopping back and forth. It's more efficient that way. The first presentation is by Greg Fealy. Greg is Associate Professor of Indonesia Politics at the Department of Political and Social Change, the Coral Bell School here at ANU. The second presentation is based on the work of three authors, Robert Sparrow, Teguh Dartanto, and Renate Hartwig. They are academics at Wageningen University in the Netherlands, the University of Indonesia in Jakarta, and George August University of Göttingen University in Germany. Last but not least, we have Hal Hill, Emeritus Professor of Economics in the Art Gordon Department of Economics at Crawford School ANU, a longtime supporter and participant in the Indonesia project, for which we are immensely grateful. Thank you very much, Hal. And thanks to all of you. Just before we start the presentations, I'd like to make a couple of more or less housekeeping comments. We'll have a Q&A session at the end of the presentations. You can use either your Q&A box or the raised hand icon. Please keep your questions short. No multi-part questions, no long comments. Single questions only, please. And then at the end, towards the end, we'll also have a voluntary poll. We'll ask you some questions about how you viewed the sessions, et cetera, et cetera. So let us start now. Greg, over to you.
Thank you very much, Blaine. And it's a pleasure to speak at the first online Indonesia update, having attended a great many on-campus updates. So this is a new experience for me. And I'm going to be delivering the political update. And you'll see from the screen there that the title is Jokowi in the COVID era, Repressive Pluralism, Dynasticism and the Overbearing State. The COVID virus has been the severest political test for Jokowi's presidency so far, and his responses to it have been revealing. He's almost 1 year into his second and final term, the term in which he wants to make an indelible mark on Indonesian history. He's well aware of the near universal view that his predecessor, Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, had achieved very little in his second term. Jokowi, ever impatient, ever ambitious, began this term wanting not just to consolidate on what he had done in his first term, but to far exceed those achievements with even bolder, more visionary projects. He wants to leave a tangible legacy, and the new capital in East Kalimantan was meant to be the crowning example of this. But there are also many other elements: expanded industrial technological centres, greatly improved educational and research capacity. Indeed, it was a very broad portfolio of ambitions that Jokowi had. In short, this was to be a transformational period. And Jokowi would be remembered as a great builder of Indonesia, at least equal to Suharto. Well, that was the plan until the COVID crisis broke in Indonesia in early March. For Jokowi, now realising, if realising Jokowi's plans would have been difficult beforehand, the COVID pandemic threatened to destroy a great many of those plans. Even holding the ground looked to be a long shot. The economy is already contracted sharply and may continue to do so, and the COVID crisis, as I'll be discussing in a moment, has continued to worsen. So all of this has concentrated Jokowi's mind on what is most important to him, the economy and development. Everything else is dispensable, including many of the broader social and political agendas that helped to bring him to power. Many scholars have remarked before about Jokowi's thin and attenuating commitment to rights and democratisation issues. He supports them so long as they don't cost much political capital and don't adversely impact on his economic agenda. But now, when the economy is in crisis, most of those reform agendas have been swiftly shed, a bit like baggage cast over the side of a boat that's taking on water. So what we now behold is core Jokowi. So this is the frame that I wish to use for this presentation. What has the COVID virus taught us about Jokowi as a political leader of Indonesia? So I'm actually going to be spending a few minutes talking about the COVID response itself, partly because many of the other speakers in this conference are going to be talking about that, and they will know a lot more about it than me. What I'm going to be discussing is the political aspects of the crisis, and you'll see from the outline slide in front of you, talking about the political crisis itself before moving on to three other broad developments, most of which are interlinked. The first is securitization of the COVID response and civil administration. The second is repressive pluralism and the rolling back of Islamism. And the third is dynasticism and the 2024 presidential election. So, to the next slide, please. So, the basic statistics, go ahead. Just a little bit of a line. So the basic statistics, and I've just taken these from Worldometer yesterday, and they give us the current count, or as of yesterday, as of the 6th of September. You'll see that the current COVID cases are a little over 190,000, the deaths are almost 8,000, and the number of recovered is 136. 1,000. In the past week, we have had a growing sense, I think, of the COVID infection rates beginning to get out of control in Indonesia. So 3 days in the last week have seen record infection rates, especially bad in Jakarta, over 1,300 people per day being added to the list of infections. There's near universal acknowledgement. Could I have the next couple of slides? So this is a slide showing the total number of cases of infection. And the next slide, please, which shows the number of deaths. And you'll see the rising trajectory of those. And then the last slide gives us the red provinces, or the ones which have the most severe COVID infection rate. And as the colours get lighter, basically that becomes less severe. But you'll see most of Java is in the severe category. And as I mentioned before, Jakarta most severe of all. Next slide, please. So there's near universal acknowledgement that official figures fall well below the true infection rate and death toll. And some officials predict that but the real figure is between 4 to 10 times greater than what the official rate is. There's been growing criticism from experts of the government's response, particularly focusing on what are seen as inadequate mitigation efforts, confusing messaging to the public, and an excessive reliance on the production of a vaccine in the near future. And if a vaccine is not produced and rolled out in a sweeping manner by early 2021, then the economic impacts of this could be significant. And we're already having worrying signs of this, with factories closed in the Jakarta region due to infection outbreaks, major foreign donors making, or investors making decisions to hold off setting up new factories in Indonesia due to what they think is an excessive COVID risk. So how has Jokowi responded to all of this? Next slide, please. Initially, of course, he downplayed the virus, expecting that Indonesia might not be affected and that this indeed would become an economic opportunity for Indonesia, always looking for an economic opportunity. In March, as the virus hit, he became increasingly more anxious and uncertain. He was caught in the dilemma that every government has faced about COVID, of whether to prioritise public health or economic activity. He was worried the government didn't have enough money to fund a long-term lockdown. He also felt there was a real prospect of social unrest and leading to political unrest. And so he vacillated between public health objectives and economic recovery. After sustained pressure from business groups in late April, early May, he decided to opt for economic recovery, prioritising economic recovery. And he ordered a range of social and economic relief packages and also the easing of restrictions, the so-called new normal in Indonesia. Over the past 6 weeks, we've seen his mood lighten even more. He now seems relaxed and positively buoyant. He seems convinced that he's made the right choice, almost boastful at times. And he's taking solace in comparative figures. Indonesia is doing much better than other countries with big populations, frequently citing the cases of India, the United States and Brazil. He told governors in mid-July that Indonesia would have had a minus 17% growth rate if he had entered into a full lockdown. He said even though Indonesia has the 4th largest population, it's not in the top 10 list of countries for infection. So he clearly feels vindicated in the policy mix that he has undertaken. He's convinced he's made the right decision. By mid-August, his mood was even more sanguine. Indeed, he displayed vaulting optimism about the scale of Indonesia's ability to bounce back. He told the NPR in his National Day speech in mid-August that COVID was like a computer crash and that Indonesia would have to reboot its economy. And he then spoke about turning the crisis into an opportunity to make great leaps forward. He talked about the transformation of the economy from procedure-driven to results-driven, from standard work to outstanding work, from complicated long procedures to smart shortcuts. You can see in the speech Jokowi's vision for an efficient and developed Indonesia, but you can also sense his frustration that perhaps a crisis will hasten long overdue reforms, but then again, perhaps it mightn't. This appears his whole talking up of the prospects of bounce back seemed fanciful to me, and his rhetoric is eerily similar to that used to somewhat notorious autocratic leaders such as Pol Pot in Cambodia or Mao's Great Leap Forward in China, that somehow Indonesia will surge ahead as if deep structural and cultural problems that have prevented Indonesia reaching its full potential can suddenly be cast aside by the pandemic. And you can see Jokowi hoping to salvage some of his glimmering dream of high economic performance before the end of his term. But it's also a gamble with public health, a battle to get enough adherence to the mitigation protocols and that infection rates will be controlled while the economy recovers. In my inexpert judgment, because I'm neither an economist nor an epidemiologist, it's not working. The rates are continuing to rise, as we saw from the figures before, and that this is going to sap economic confidence. And there is a risk of Indonesia ending up with intolerably high death rates and a recession. And I would refer you to Markus Mietzner, my colleague in the Department of Political and Social Change, who's written a number of excellent articles on the COVID impact in Indonesia and the policy consequences of that. So let me move to the next topic, and that is the securitization of COVID measures and public administration. An increasingly important part of Jokowi's COVID management strategy is the use of the military. And this is part of a broader trend during his presidency of expanding the role of security agencies, not only the military, TNI, but also the police and the National Intelligence Agency, BIN. It's what we might call Jokowi's securitizing of the management of social and political problems. He's rolled out some 340,000 police and military officers to enforce his COVID protocols. The military and intelligence agencies have stepped up surveillance measures, particularly related to COVID. And we've even had BIN and TNI directly involved in the development of a COVID medicine, one that's been widely criticised. So let me look a bit more at TNI. Jokowi has been consistent in his expansion of the role of the military, particularly the army. He's increased their role in counterterrorism, in public indoctrination campaigns, in development of village infrastructure, even in guarding prisons. And he's reversed important parts of Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono's policy of trying to keep TNI in the barracks. Under COVID, Jokowi has taken this to a new level. The slides. So he appointed the man who was on the screen before. Sorry, I'm not controlling the slides and I'm not giving very good instructions to the person who is. Was Andika Perkasa. He is the son-in-law of Hendro Priyono, a very powerful military general and former intelligence figure, and he's also the commander of the Indonesian army. And he's been appointed to the deputy head of the COVID committee under Erick Thohir. Another military officer, Doni Manadi, was appointed to the head of the COVID quick response unit. So these military people are brought into key roles. More importantly than that, Jokowi announced a presidential instruction, number 6, a couple of months ago, which greatly widens the ability of TNI to penetrate into civilian domains under the rubric of COVID protocols, COVID discipline. And TNI is to guard more than 83,000 villages across Indonesia, particularly in hotspots, these zona merah. And they are also guaranteed a role in rolling out vaccines when they are ready, which will ensure that they maintain this close involvement in public affairs well into next year. Jokowi often speaks of the army's rollout in connection to the need to discipline society. Almost every day, he emphasises the disciplining of society as crucial to Indonesia's response to COVID. And it's clear that Jokowi is fearful of possible unrest, and he believes that TNI will be much more effective than the police in countering this. And he also no doubt believes that TNI responds to his orders much more promptly and thoroughly than what many of his own ministers and bureaucrats will do. So if he gives an order to TNI, he's confident that it will be followed quickly, it will be enacted quickly. Many critics have accused Jokowi of seeking to return to the new order. But Jun Honna, a former ANU alumni, has provided very persuasive analysis. And the next slide, please. so here's soldiers instructing citizens in how to put on their masks. Next slide. Here's a photo of a person who's breached the COVID protocols and is being made to sweep the street. Other people have been made to do push-ups in public places. So this is the kind of TNI under this Impress number 6 has the authority to issue sanctions to people who breach these guidelines. Next slide. And so this brings us to Jokowi. So yes, these accusations that he's wanting to bring TNI back into a military role. And Jun Honor points out very clearly that Jokowi's aim is much more an instrumentalisation of TNI. And he observes that the TNI, using the TNI, makes Jokowi look resolute and strong. And that the TNI rollout is not about TNI resuming a major political role, but it is about them being engaged in society. It serves the institutional interests. Among other things, it helps them to preserve their territorial command system, which is very important for future funding and social influence functions. But undoubtedly, this is a regressive step for democracy. Reformists have long argued that a key cornerstone of democracy is returning TNI to a pure professional defence role. And having TNI involved in many of the functions that now find themselves in is not consistent with that at all. The other criticism, and I think a very valid one that's made here, is that a much more effective strategy would be for the government to persuade the public to follow the COVID guidelines, not to coerce or intimidate them by having large men in uniform on street corners telling them what to do. So the COVID mobilisation is just one aspect of Jokowi's concessions to TNI. He's also granted them the authority to develop a national food estate, which will be a very big project indeed. They've even been involved in the signing of a defence power agreement, at least the Defence Ministry have, with a US provider. In addition to TNI, the police have done very well out of Jokowi. He's appointed a record number of police generals to senior public service roles, many of them outside the security or legal expertise of those police generals. One survey showed that there are 7% of state-owned enterprise commissioners and now police officers. That's almost 400 officers across a range of state-owned enterprises. One explanation of this is because of the political gratitude that Jokowi feels to the Indonesian police for their support for him, their tacit support for him, sometimes not so tacit, during last year's presidential election. Another decision that's drawn a lot of comment is a decision several months ago that the State Intelligence Agency, BIN, should answer directly to the President rather than to the Coordinating Minister for Politics, Law and Security, Mahfud, MD, a civilian. And effectively this enhances BIN's power and reduces the level of independent security of its functions and its decisions by other parts of the security government establishment and the government, its civilian authorities. So in effect, this is expanding BIN's role. And this comes at a time when there is growing intimidation of critics of the regime, of the government, of dissenters. This is coming from buzzers, from trolls, cyber attacks as well, often hacking into the social media accounts of critics of the government. And for the next slide, thank you. A really good example of this is one of the most trenchant critics of the government's COVID responses is this University of Indonesia epidemiologist, Pandu Riono. And his social media accounts were hacked and photos of him with women were placed on those sites. And there's a lot of this happening. A lot of analysts believe that only state agencies have the capacity to do this. But it's not out of the realms of possibility. There could be pro-Jokowi forces elsewhere that are also engaged in it. So this brings me to the next topic, and that is repressive pluralism. So it's often argued that ideology is irrelevant to contemporary Indonesian politics, or at the best declining relevance. And that ideological differences don't really mark that much of a boundary between major political leaders and parties. And there's a good deal of truth in that. But there's one level at which ideology does still matter, and that is regarding the role of religion in the state, and specifically Islam. This, of course, has been one of the most enduring and profound cleavages throughout Indonesian history, dating back even before the founding of the nation, as to whether Indonesia was to be a state based on Islam, a secular state, or a religiously neutral state. Of course, the compromise was for a religiously neutral state. But debate and tension about this religious issue has risen periodically throughout Indonesia's history. Over the past 3 years, this ideological polarisation has emerged again and taken on a new form. It's effectively a culture war between what is now termed pluralists and Islamists. Once they might have been known as secular nationalists and Islamic leaders. But the broad parameters of this debate between pluralists and Islamists are very familiar indeed. Islamists are those who want Islamic law and principles to be central in public life. They want more Islamic law. They want privileged recognition of Islam and the Muslim community, its majority status in Indonesia's public life. Many groups fall into this Islamist category, parties such as PKS, PPP, also the Islamic Defenders Front, a public organisation, various others, the banned Hizb ut-Tahrir organisation as well. But there are plenty of Islamists within large organisations like Muhammadiyah and Nahdlatul Ulama who also show sympathy with this more conservative view of Islam. The pluralists have a commitment to religious tolerance and harmony, well, at least in theory. In the pure sense of the word, a pure pluralist is someone who believes that no one religion can be a sole source of truth, and that the state must acknowledge this and accommodate a diversity of beliefs. And and in this regard, the first principle of Pancasila, the belief in one Almighty God, is a pillar of the pluralist ideological setting. There's a broad array of groups in this pluralist category. The largest party, PDIP, also Nahdlatul Ulama, the bulk of Nahdlatul Ulama, its party PKB, other non-Muslim groups, and many sections of mainstream parties like Golkar and Nasdem as well. The important thing is that pluralists have come to see Islamism as an existential threat to Indonesia, as something so dangerous that if it is allowed to succeed, when the very nature of the Indonesian state would be imperilled. The primary driver of this renewed sense of threat of Islam, perspective of threat, was the anti-Ahok mobilisation in 2016, 2017, which has been much discussed. And some of the measures that were taken to combat the rise of Islamism, perceived rise of Islamism, being well documented in other updates. Government crackdown, for example, the laying of charges against various Islamist leaders who were involved in the anti-Ahok protests. Tom Power's 2018 political update paper was excellent on this. We've also had the banning of the Islamist organisation Hizb ut-Tahrir in 2017, and a broad sense among many Islamist communities that they are on government hit lists. But the program is far more wide-ranging than these very public actions that I've been referring to, and its full extent is under-researched. There is a large, systematic, informal, and often secretive campaign to pressure and block Islamists, both within public and private sectors. For example, public servants, academics, executives in private companies are finding themselves summoned to their supervisors and told that their names have appeared on lists of problematic people who hold views that are deemed to be incompatible with Indonesia's good order, usually because they support Islamist ideals or they're a member of an Islamist organisation that is in this problematic category. The term most often used is extremist, but this term is very loosely defined and indeed can be very broadly applied. So the most commonly heard in this extremist category are ex-members of Hizb ut-Tahrir. Next slide, please. which is an organisation that promoted the idea of the restoration of the caliphate or khilafah. And this was the organisation banned 3 years ago. But there are a lot of other groups, including the Islamist party PKS, which repeatedly find themselves targets of this same kind of activity. The government has also been systematically purging mosque management of mosques in state campuses, university campuses, and also state-owned enterprises, purging anyone who has an Islamist background from those, usually replacing them with people from NU or Muhammadiyah. They've been certifying preachers. And this has been happening in the private sector as well. So this has become a serious human rights issue that has consequences for the quality of Indonesia's democracy. Probably many tens of thousands of people have been subject to discrimination on the basis of their religious beliefs. And for the great majority of these people, their beliefs break no laws, nor do they contravene any regulations. Indeed, they should be seen as a natural part of a vibrant democracy in a country as large and as religious as Indonesia. The politics behind this is that the pluralists have come to see the second Jokowi term as an opportunity, a propitious moment for Islamist rollback, for turning the tide back against the Islamists. They're increasingly confident that they have the political power, they have the support of key state institutions, security institutions to achieve this. And what's more, they believe that the indications of the last year and a half are that they are winning, that the Islamists are on the defensive. And so they have increasing self-confidence that the Islamists are marginalised, fragmented, and in considerable internal disarray. In effect, this is a large-scale social engineering project designed to deter Indonesians from adopting or pursuing more conservative Islamic lifestyles and ideals. It risks equating Islamism in all of its variations with anti-state and anti-Pancasila activities. And there's a paradox here that protection of pluralism seemingly involves the undermining of it. So the government is pursuing a very selective, increasingly narrow definition of pluralism and what is acceptable by the state. We have a number of other manifestations to this, and I see that I'm probably running out of time to talk about them, but one of them, can I have the next slide, please, Dorothy, is the launch by PDIP of a bill about Pancasila ideological guidelines, the HIP bill in Parliament in the middle of the year. And this was an attempt by PDIP ideologues to reintroduce into mainstream society the ideals of Sukarnoism, and particularly Sukarnoism as the antidote to Islamism. And within this bill, there was talk about these Sukarnoist principles, these Mahainist principles that haven't been much discussed in the public domain for probably more than 60 or 70 years, about Trisila, that Pancasila could be boiled down to 3 principles and then ultimately to 1 principle, which was gotong royong, or mutual assistance. And predictably, many Islamist groups were incensed at this because they felt this was a downplaying of the role of religion in the significance of religion as part of the Pancasila formulation. And indeed, many PDIP politicians were very open in describing this as an anti-radicalisation measure, an anti-extremist measure. So they were seeing this opportunity to act in this way. We also, at the same time, saw growing tension between Islamists on the streets, between Islamists and PDIP. For the first time, we're beginning to find confrontation between the two. PDIP cadre destroyed an image of Habib Rizik, one of the leaders of an Islamist group, which led to them being reported to the police. There have been firebomb attacks on a PDIP headquarters in West Java. So we've had this tit-for-tat process underway. Nothing particularly serious, but you can feel the temperature rising. We've also had a response from the Islamists, the foundation, if we could go to the next slide. So these are people protesting the HIP bill, and you'll see protesting communism because the HIP bill did not include or did not insert the decision of 1966, which prohibited communism and the Communist Party. So they saw these as wrapped up together, downplaying Islam, opening the door for a return of communism. Next slide. And so this is Gatot Nurmantio, a rather notorious former head of the armed forces, a very experienced sectarian politician who led the launch of this organisation, KAMI, very much as a reaction to this HIP legislation. So this was very much a gross miscalculation by PDIP because it aroused a wide array of forces, including TNI and NU, who are supposed to be allies in this ideological campaign. But in actual fact, they repudiated that legislation. It's been withdrawn and it's unlikely to appear in that same form again. So what's Jokowi's role in all of this? I mentioned before he's not particularly ideologically engaged, but he is nonetheless a pluralist, and he is deeply fearful about the ability of Islam to damage him politically. So he seems happy to allow these ideological warriors to conduct their campaign against Islamism. Next slide, thank you. And this was the launch of KAMI in Jakarta. So next slide, thank you. So this brings me to Dynasticism. Blaine, how am I going for time? 5 minutes, okay, it should be good. So Dynasticism, next slide, thank you. So perhaps the biggest surprise of 2020 was Jokowi's dynastic turn. Keep in mind, Jokowi had come to power with a narrative of being a political outsider. He had risen from his humble birth, put himself through the prestigious University Gadjah Mada, become a public servant and then a successful entrepreneur, and then last of all, a politician. And all the way through this extraordinary career, he had done it by dint of his own talent and hard work. In some ways, he was the quintessential reformasi politician, without elite connections to secure his advancement and no powerful patrons or nepotism to call on. So political observers, and especially his more idealistic supporters, were taken aback when, in the middle of the year, Jokowi publicly gave his blessing to his son Gibran. You'll see a photo of him here, 33 years of age, and his son-in-law, Bobby Afif Nasution. I'll have a photo of him in a moment. Perhaps a couple, if you flick through a couple of photos. No, one more, and one more. And so there's Bobby with his father-in-law. So if we can go back 2 slides now. One more, thank you. So Jokowi gave his approval to them to contest the mayoral elections in the cities of Solo in Central Java and Medan in North Sumatra. Both relatives are running for Jokowi's own party, PDIP, which they only joined in March of this year. Moreover, to become PDIP mayoral nominees, they needed to displace well-established, long-serving local PDIP politicians. Initially, this was cast by the palace and Jokowi himself as a case of family members wanting to run for politics and Jokowi reluctantly agreeing. He claimed he wasn't helping them. But information from within palace circles, and also judging by Jokowi's own actions, publicly observable actions, this interpretation, this version is completely false. Jokowi, in fact, we hear, complained to his family that none of his children wanted to follow him into politics. His youngest son, Kesan, has long been known to be interested in politics, but was regarded as too green at the moment. And eventually, Gibran, his eldest son, acceded to his father's wishes and decided to nominate as a mayoral candidate. He has no experience in politics at all and very little experience in any organisation of any sort. Interestingly, at this point, Jokowi then began intervening or allowing others to intervene on his behalf to smooth the path of both his son and his son-in-law. PDIP's central leadership pressured local branches in Solo and PDIP branches in Solo and Medan to accept Gibran and Bobby's nominations. There was staunch resistance in both cases, but this was eventually overridden. Jokowi then, in the case of Solo, Jokowi then invited the vanquished candidate, Ahmad Purnomo, who was the deputy mayor, to lunch with him at the palace in Jakarta. and Jokowi offered him a job, a cushy job in Jakarta, which Purnomo took pleasure in rejecting and telling the press about it afterwards. Jokowi then instructed his brother-in-law, Purwanto, who was running for the residency of Gunung Kidul, to withdraw from the election race, seemingly because Jokowi wanted to avoid the appearance of widespread nepotism within his family. So Purwanto's established political career was sacrificed for the sake of Gibran's. So we can see here Jokowi's, not for the first time, Jokowi's steely determination to get what he wants. Why is he doing this? There are obviously political risks. Opinion polls show the majority of voters disapprove of political dynasties. Jokowi's own reform credentials, already badly tarnished, may be further damaged if his son and son-in-law win the elections but fail as mayors. One of the reasons Jokowi is doing this is because he seems to want Gibran to have a career like his own, where he rises from power from municipal politics to provincial politics and then ultimately to national politics, quite possibly as president. And in doing so, Gibran would not only perpetuate the kind of programs that Jokowi has come to see as essential to Indonesia's future prosperity, but it would also vouchsafe a future role for Jokowi himself in Indonesia's future. And I think the more uncertain Jokowi's second term looks, the more he's investing in Gibran's future in the political system. Even more importantly than the impact of Jokowi's dynasticism on his own family is what it's done to the political system as a whole. With Jokowi having allowed family members or encouraged family members into politics, he can hardly discourage others from doing the same. So there's been a tsunami of dynastic appointments, nominations over the last couple of months. And Jokowi has in fact been encouraging some of his cabinet colleagues to engage in this because it takes some of the spotlight off him. So the Vice President, Ma'ruf Amin, his daughter, Siti Nuraziza, is running for the mayoralty position in South Tangerang, which is also being contested by Prabowo's niece, Rahayu Saraswati, former politician. The Cabinet Secretary, Pramono Anung's son Dita, is running for the position of Bupati in Kediri. The Agricultural Affairs Minister, Syahrul Limpau's younger brother, Irman, is also a candidate in Makassar, and on it goes. We don't have any detailed figures of this, but one study suggested that as many as 130 dynastic nominations will be present in December's regional direct elections that are taking place. So this isn't just about elite families perpetuating themselves, it's also related to the 2024 presidential election. It's about gaining leverage to improve the prospects of one set of candidates or another. In the case of Mega, and can we show the next one? Just one thing, Gibran is not without some political flair. This is him writing yesterday to the Solo Election Commission office in looking sangat Jawa, very Javanese gear, in an old bike. And this is kind of stunt that his father was actually quite good at doing. Although he's politically inexperienced, he looks like a fast learner and very determined. So Megawati, one last slide, next one more. So Megawati and Prabowo are happy to facilitate the advancement of Jokowi's son and son-in-law because they're hoping that he will reciprocate when they want to nominate Prabowo and Puan for the presidency in 2024. Whether Jokowi will do so is another matter because their polling results are not very good. But nonetheless, now that politicians know that Jokowi is prone to dynastic inducements, this will become into a feature of negotiation with him. So it's another aggressive step for politics. So to conclude, the political updates for the last 5 years have really been talking very much about Indonesia's democratic regression, and that is the case again this year. It has continued, it has worsened. I used in the title the words the overbearing state, and that is increasingly a feature of Indonesia under Jokowi's presidency. He's always been a president without a strong conceptual framework and strong commitment to principles, normative principles, beyond those of economic growth and development. And we see increasingly the consequences of this in his political behaviour. The pandemic has accentuated these tendencies as he comes to feel as if he can no longer afford to serve broader agendas. everything is focused on salvaging as much of his economic plan as he can. He's revealed himself as an arch pragmatist and someone who's willing to bequeath to Indonesia a system that is far more dynastic, securitized, and intimidating the one that he succeeded in as president from Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Greg. Really appreciate that. Now we'll hear the second presentation based on work from Robert Sparrow, Teguh Dartanto, and Renate Hartwig. So Robert, the floor is yours.
Okay, great. So let me share my screen first. There it is. Can everyone see the slides? Yeah. Can you see them, Blaine? Okay. If everyone can see my slides, then
Robert,
can you
you're
see
muted,
the slides, Blaine?
Robert.
I'm still muted. Okay. Sorry. Am I still muted? Can you hear me now? Yeah. Okay. Good. So, well, thank you for inviting me or inviting us for this economics update. And I would have loved to be there. I would have loved to have been there in Canberra, catching up with everyone. But I guess we have no alternative now than to do all of this online. And I really congratulate the Indonesia project with the online setup that they've managed to arrange in, I guess, such a short time. I think it's a very impressive lineup for this week. Now, this presentation and also the related paper that will follow this update is worked together with Teguh Dartanto and Renate Hartwig. Teguh is with the University of Indonesia, and Renate is with the University of Göttingen in Germany. Now, due to logistics, Renate or Teguh will present the presentation together with me. So I'll start. Teguh will take over later, and Renate will be available later in the Q&A for all the difficult questions. She is. Please direct them to her. Now, in this update, what we'll do, we'll give you a. Sorry, my slides are not. Yeah. I'm having a little bit of a glitch. Is the slide overview visible now? At the just having a look at Blaine. Can you see the slides change, Blaine? Because I'm having a bit of a glitch with my computer. Okay, good. Okay, good. Then I'll continue. Now, with the setup of this week, with a lot of presentations going into more detail, what we'll do today is we'll give you sort of an overview, essentially following up on some of the slides Greg just showed, looking at the COVID situation in Indonesia, highlighting that there's been an acceleration of infections actually since March, and still ongoing. We'll briefly discuss the instruments that are available to the government for dealing with this with the COVID crisis. We'll briefly run you through some of the economic developments. We'll focus on the economic downturn, some of the implications for poverty, and then Teguh will take you through the policy response and the fiscal packages that have been set in place. Now, we'll briefly touch on these issues. There's a number of papers that will go into this deeper later on, for example, on poverty or labor markets or the burden on the health system. But we'll try to pick out some of the key issues that we think are very important to focus on, let's say, in the broader picture. Now, let me start just with an overview of a sort of brief overview of the COVID pandemic in Indonesia. I guess this is the same graph that Greg just showed us, except that I think we've added some other countries in the region to compare Indonesia with. So Indonesia is here, the heavy line, and then we have the Philippines there, and then Singapore here, and then we have Thailand, Malaysia, Vietnam down here. And we clearly see that in terms of cases, Indonesia, together with the Philippines really leading the pack here in the region, and the COVID pandemic seems to be out of control, at least in Indonesia and in the Philippines. Now, of course, these are total number of cases so far. Of course, Philippines and Indonesia are much larger countries in terms of population than some of the other countries in the slide. But one thing that is striking here is that, of course, you see these lines still increasing and accelerating. Whereas in other countries in the region, there have been accelerations, but most or all of the other countries here in this slide have been able to curb the increase or to flatten the curve, which is a term we've heard a lot lately. So these countries have been able to flatten the curve, but Indonesia and the Philippines clearly have not been able to do so. And we see the same for the death rates. So death rates in Indonesia are accelerating fast or increasing fast. They're much higher, in fact, than in the Philippines, even though the number of cases known in the Philippines is quite high. And this is also reflected if we look, for example, at the death rates. We see that the death rates, so the number of people that die relative to the number of cases, is relatively high in Indonesia, at about 4%, 4.4%. What we also see is that the largest increase in the number of deaths, which is almost up to 8,000, has really occurred since essentially since May, right? So out of the 8,000 deaths, about 6,000 have occurred in the months of June, July, and August. Essentially, since most of the relaxation of the restrictions, the death rates have still continued quite a high pace. And we won't go into the undercounting. Greg also referred to this. That there is some criticism on the measurement of the incidence of the infection rates and the death rates, that these are underestimates, but indeed that this is hard. It's very likely that these are underestimates. Now, I just want to take these two slides and put them in one, combine them in one graph to point out a few things. So here we have, might be quite a complicated slide here, but here on the left-hand side, we have the new cases and new deaths. And then on the right-hand side, we have the totals, so the cumulative cases and cumulative number of deaths. And then the totals are the cumulative numbers are the smooth lines. And then in the bars, we have the daily incidents. And this is drawing a line essentially since early March, when the first cases were known. And a number of events have happened since then. So around mid-March, the work from home request or instructions came out, where schools and other firms, ministries, public institutions start working from home. And then later in early April, the restrictions were in fact imposed. So we had the social distancing restrictions, travel ban following soon after. And then around May or early June, some of these restrictions were relaxed, framed under the preparation for the new normal. Of course, some of these restrictions have been continued in specific regions. For example, in Jakarta, where we have transitional social distancing restrictions still in place. Now, what we want to point out here, and again, referring back to Greg's comment that the COVID, here we see that the incidents, the daily incidents here, the daily reported new cases, around 3,000 in the last couple of days. And Greg referred to this as evidence that, or an indication that the COVID spread was out of control. Now, if we look at the graph or the trend line here, and of course we have these daily fluctuations going up and down, but I would suggest that, or this graph suggests that, in fact, the COVID spread has been out of control essentially since March, right? Because we see a continuing acceleration in the infection rate since March, right? We see actually very nice, this could be the bottom part of a very nice exponential curve, right, where we see a continuing acceleration of the infection rates. And that goes, now the WHO norm or WHO definition of having the spread of COVID under control is that we have actually a deceleration of at least 2 weeks, and Indonesia has never actually got near that point of a deceleration, not before, not during the restrictions or the periods after. So there are some periods, of course, where we could see maybe some plateauing, but still we see even here in this period where we see that the peaks are not really increasing, there still is a slight increase. So infections and deaths have been accelerating ever since early March, which suggests that there has been no point in this period that the spread of the virus has been under control. Now we see the cases. Most of the cases are, of course, in Jakarta, on Java, mainly in Jakarta and East Java. We see the large surge in the last weeks, or last month, especially in Jakarta. Now with this, when we're looking at trying to curb or stop an acceleration of the infection rate, besides a lockdown or economic or social distancing restrictions, a key policy instrument is the testing and contact tracing capacity, and that's still an instrument that is still underdeveloped in Indonesia. So what we see here are the tests being done cumulative per 1,000 people in Indonesia and some neighboring countries, and here we see that Indonesia still performs relatively slow or has a very low rate of testing compared to, for example, Malaysia or Philippines. So Indonesia is still testing, well, not testing enough. I believe only in Jakarta is currently meeting the WHO standards of the number of tests per day. And we see this low testing capacity also in what we call the positive rates. So the positive rates are remaining fairly high. Now, what does it mean? Here we have a graph where we show the number of positive cases, or the positive diagnoses, as a share of the total tests being done. So what we see in Indonesia is that these tests the number of positive cases is sort of fluctuating, especially the last couple of months, around 13 to 18%. And that is quite high. Only Philippines gets close to this, but as you see, a lot of other countries, their positive ratios are quite low, well below 3%. Now the WHO target is around 5%, right. And the reason for having a target to keeping it low is that in order for testing to be effective, you want to really throw your net wide, right? You want to essentially what we call conduct a broad testing strategy, testing as many people as you can. Now, Indonesia is still following essentially a narrow testing strategy, which basically means that the testing is really geared to those with symptoms or people that are really already in need of medical attention, rather than trying to test the broader population. Now, one of the problems for this specific policy instrument is that there are systemic constraints to the testing capacity. So that tends to be, most likely this is due to infrastructure, lack of facilities, lack of tests. And what we also see is there is essentially a lack of systematic contact tracing. So a lot of the contact tracing still relies on retrospective reports by people that have been tested positive, rather than relying on records. For example, if you go to a restaurant or you go to a mall, are records being taken of who enters, who has been at the restaurant or not. So these procedures are really important for being able to follow up on those people that have been infected, to test who in their neighborhood or who in their daily activities has been in close contact with these people. And so that's really the key to the strategy of testing and tracing, or finding people that are infected and following up. Now, what I would just like to highlight, again, go back to that narrow and broad testing strategy and why this is so important. So testing has two functions, right? If we want to test, when we're testing people that either have symptoms or don't have symptoms, but the first of course, objective is to make the diagnosis, right? To take a diagnosis and if necessary, follow up with medical treatment. But the second function of testing is to essentially use it as a surveillance system and trying to identify who is infected in the population, and also to capture those with asymptomatic mild cases, so those that are not likely to be observed, who might not be aware of being infected, but are still being able to carry on the disease or spread the disease. And that's the broad strategy, net testing strategy, trying to cast that net very wide, so you capture those cases as well. And right, with a broad testing strategy, what you'd expect is very low positive rates, as the WHO states, a target of 5% or lower, so that you also get those asymptomatic cases as well, rather than that you have a strategy of testing that essentially follows the patients rather than that you try to follow try to sort of get a good sense of the spread of the disease. So this is one reason why we do suspect that the reporting of the disease or the numbers that we see now in the graphs we just showed are an underestimate. Now, just to conclude on the situation of COVID in Indonesia. So, first conclusion, very clearly, COVID is not under control. It has never been under control, and infections are still increasing. In fact, they're still accelerating. And the recent increase to 3,000 are actually not a surprise if you look at the long-term trend, right? They fit the long-term or this accelerating curve very nicely. So at this stage, the acceleration is still happening, and the crisis and the COVID is not under control. Now, in terms of the policy instruments to deal with the crisis, at the moment there's very severe shortcomings to the instruments for dealing with COVID. First of all, a lockdown has been ruled out by the government. Now that's a choice, right? That's not a systemic shortcoming. That is a choice, that's a policy choice, but that is one of the key instruments, or that has been applied by many countries for curbing the COVID crisis. The second key policy instrument is testing and tracing capacity. Now that is very limited, and it takes some time. Of course, this is something to invest in, but that takes time. Investing in testing capacity, setting up information systems for contact tracing, that takes time, but it is a crucial instrument. But at the moment, it is severely limited. So that leaves only one option, essentially, for dealing with COVID, and that is with essentially public health measures, or to some extent imposing public health measures, wearing face masks, social distancing, but just relying on behavior of individual of the population is very difficult. And we also see it's difficult for many people are not so diligent in complying to this advice. And that's not specifically an Indonesian problem. We see this around the world, right? We see this with the relaxation of restrictions in Europe. We see a rebound in infections. We see that for example, in the US, this has been a big problem. So just relying on public health measures is not enough for curbing this acceleration. So clearly, there needs to be more investment in the testing and contact tracing, or also maybe a more stricter implementation of restrictions. Now, this, just checking how I'm doing for time. Now, the COVID crisis has had severe impacts on the economy. So here we have the GDP, quarterly GDP growth numbers of the last 23 years since the financial crisis, the Asian financial crisis in the late 90s. And this is the largest slump in at least quarterly GDP growth since the crisis. Now, these are year-on-year numbers. So what this line is showing here is the GDP growth of a specific quarter relative to that same quarter a year before, just to take out some seasonal trends. But we clearly see that this is the largest slump we've seen in Indonesia since 1998. Now, this is a severe contraction, but of course it's still relatively modest to some of the countries in the region. So here's a list of countries that we also saw in some of the graphs on the COVID. So we see Indonesia here at 5.3% reduction, but we see that in Malaysia, for example, and the Philippines, the contraction is much stronger. Same goes for Singapore and Thailand. Vietnam here is the odd one out. It's really been able to avoid a contraction. But so here, Indonesia has been hit hard, but other countries in the region have been hit harder, presumably also due to a stricter implementation of social distancing restrictions that have hit the economy. And we do see a large variation across sectors. So some sectors have been hit very, very hard, and no surprise to which sectors those are. So we see that the transportation and storage sector has seen a reduction, has seen a contraction of 30%. Accommodation and restaurants, so also the tourism sector has seen a negative growth of more than 20%. Business services, and here some important sectors like manufacturing, trade have all reduced. But then there are also some sectors that have been benefiting from this, right? So we have the information and communication sector, clearly a strong demand for more information and communication services, specifically online services. Interesting here is also agriculture has a small positive, a small growth, this is most likely due to, most of this growth here comes from crop production. So most likely this is due to the delayed rice harvest that was delayed into the second quarter, which gives a little positive boost to agriculture within all this carnage in other sectors. Now, if you look at growth, where does the growth or the negative 5% growth, where is that observed in terms of expenditure? Well, we see that household consumption is down by almost 6%. And this is, of course, important for Indonesia because it's still very much reliant on domestic consumption. Investments, exports and imports are down. Of course, trade restrictions or reduction of world trade has hit also Indonesia. So we see that both exports and imports are down, but imports are down a bit more than exports. And one surprising result here is that we see the government consumption is down. And it's not yet quite clear where that's coming from. So one of the answers could be that there's a slow disbursement of the recovery package. Could also be that this also includes regional spending. So regional budgets have declined with particular declining government revenues. There may be other disruptions to public expenditure, perhaps due to a reallocation of budgets for setting up the policy response. Maybe perhaps also due to disruptions due to essential disruptions to the bureaucracy due to work from home or restrictions, but we're not quite sure here. This is still something that we need to that needs a bit more analysis, and or maybe later in the week there might be some presentations that look at this also in more detail. Now, how am I doing for time? I'm going a bit over time. I'll wrap this up quickly and hand over to Teguh. There's two things I want to pick out here is the impact on poverty from this economic recession. Now, we don't know yet, we don't have much data yet on poverty, but what we do see is that, at least in the short term, in March 2020, BPS already reported a poverty increase. This is very early on in the crisis. So this is perhaps just the first effects of a lockdown. So we have a poverty increase relative to September, and most of this poverty increase happened in Java. So we see here increases of around 1 percentage point. So that means 1% of the population of those provinces have fallen below the poverty line. That may sound small, but still combined, this is around 1.5 million people. And also keeping in mind that poverty rates in these provinces were relatively low. For example, in Jakarta, poverty rate was about 3.5%. So add 1% to that, and you have a poverty increase of around 30% relative to the September 2019. But as we know, this was really early on in the crisis. So we're not quite sure where these poverty effects come from. And I have here a graph. I copied this from a WebS report, but I've noticed that there's an obsession in Indonesia these days with Google mobility numbers. So we thought we'd show this graph. But we do see here that when the work for home call came out, even before the restrictions that were imposed here early in April, already we saw a strong decline in mobility. So it could be that these first poverty signs are essentially the urban informal sector, near poor, that are directly hit by these early mobility restrictions. Now, the question then is, we don't know what the poverty impacts are as we speak, and could we expect these to be transient or structural? Or is this a poverty increase that could easily rebound when the economic growth picks up again? Now, these first short-term poverty impacts, most likely they reflect effects on, like I said, on the informal sector, the near poor that are immediately affected by mobility restrictions. Now, this could be potentially transient. We don't know yet for sure, but here there is a role for social protection programs. However, what we are worried about is not so much these effects, the initial effects of mobility restrictions, but more the long-term poverty effects. And they're more likely to be much more structural. And so driven by economic recession, firms going out of business and increased unemployment. And those effects are unlikely to be transient. One concern that there is that the recovery and then hopefully the reduction in unemployment may lead to a potential skill bias, maybe a skill bias recovery. So we see that there is a fear that recovery, so new people getting back into employment will not be those that lost their jobs in the first place, and that low-skilled workers, older workers, would find it very difficult to get back into the labor market when a recovery would take place. And those kind of effects on poverty are, I would say, beyond the current social protection programs that are in place. That may affect also those that are above the near poor, that are not targeted by these programs. And that would also, to avoid this, there would also need to be more support for the private sector, not just with social protection programs to households. I'm a bit over, been speaking a bit too much. I'll quickly hand over to Teguh, who will talk about the policy response. I will manage the slide, so let's see how this works.
Okay.
Sorry, if I could just interrupt. Sorry, Teguh, you're only going to have about 8 minutes or so to finish up. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Robert. Now my turn to present how the government respond to this pandemic. The government has been adaptive to respond to the pandemic and launched the several recovery packages. The recovery packages has been increased in the first launching. The government has revised 4 times of the recovery packages, starting in February with the little amount, 8.5 trillion, and the latest recovery packages are close to the 700 trillion or around the 4.2% GDP. The largest packages is into social protection, intended to boost the consumption and reduce the poverty impact. There are also several the private private sector support through the business incentives. This is most likely in the tax deduction, tax paid the government, income tax paid by government. There is also the small medium enterprises, including the latest one distributed by the president. It's like the bansos produktif or the social assistance for productive activities is for the small, micro, medium enterprise that cost 2.4 million per business. And also there is a corporate financing. This is state equity participation. And also there is a sectoral and the regional government. This is including here is like the wage subsidies directly to the worker using the PP Jamsostek database, and also in health sector. And we will focus on the largest packages of the social protection. Next, Robert. And the package focusing on the consumption and the poverty reduction, and then provided through the existing program. This is like the conditional cash transfer, PKH, food subsidy and the basic foods, and pre-work work program, and the village fund. And also this protection is expanded in the term of the coverage, and also added the new, introduced the social assistance. This is the social assistance that 39 trillion is most likely the new one, but basically this is the food and also the cash transfer for the most likely for the urban area. And the interesting one is the village fund. Some of fund for the village fund is used for the cash transfer directly to the community, but using the community-based targeting. This is a good one because reduce the exclusion error. We noted in this package for the social protection, and there is no focus for long-term unemployment. And the second one, there is no flexibility to apply the social protection because there is no on-demand application system for those affected by COVID-19. And if we look at the disbursement, the recovery package in place, but the disbursement are low. As the end of the August, the total disbursements of the package is only 31%. The social protections and the small medium enterprise packages is the largest disbursement, but the others is still less than 20%, but the corporate financing is only 0%. The low disbursement is due to some administrative burden. For example, in the health sector, the doctor and the paramedics focus on the medical treatment instead of the preparing document for incentives. For the business incentives, also small medium enterprise, lack of the socialization, especially for the business incentive. Low disbursement might delay the economic recovery. Therefore, there is urgent need to accelerate the disbursement. Next. Even though the disbursement of the social protection is highest one, that is already 56%, but there are limited scope of the social protection. The first one is the focus of the protection is consumption and poverty reduction, provided through the existing program. But this is the main concern is this program are not designed for the pandemic. Just focusing mainly for the poor and rural household, less for the urban and the lower middle income. And the other issue is the targeting database, because this is using the database mainly for 2015 database. This is good instrument for the normal time, but not for the larger shocks. And designing the new program has so far been unsuccessful because the data due to the database and the program design, and also no focus on the long-term employment. And I think the social protection is in place for tackling the poverty. However, we have to think beyond the social assistance. We have to think more on comprehensive picture on the social security system in Indonesia. The current social security system in Indonesia is not prepared for deal with the pandemic of the economic shocks. The existing social security program is focusing more on the life shock, such as the illness, death, working accidents, pension. And also the system is biased for the formal sector, missing to protect unemployment. And the COVID-19 has impacted 3.5 million of the formal and informal workers being unemployed. So consequently, this immediately impact the COVID will affect also on the membership and the financial sustainability of the social health insurance. This is the fact that during the COVID, there is a significant decrease of the active membership, or we call that the social health insurance drop out, especially for the informal sector. Just during for January, in March, and then there is 1.8 million drop out, and then March to May, 1.6 million drop out. Interestingly, the local government subsidized group is also dropped significantly. This means local government stopped their subsidy program. Or we don't know yet exactly what happened in the local government. This is maybe transfer from the reducing the transfer for central government. At the same time, the number of central government subsidized group is also constant. Even though central government has increased allocation for health as response to the COVID, but this does not appear in increase. And what are the implications of the COVID is the strong reduction on utilization. This is we use the data comparing for the normal average. In the average monthly average is for the outpatient referral, there is 8 million. But after the COVID, the bar is from the national level is around the 2.8 million. So there is a significant drop. And the significant drop is also in the big profit. The pattern is the same from the outpatient referral and the trend of the inpatient. And the significant decrease is may be due to of the social distancing, limited services during the COVID-19, reducing membership, and especially related to the Ramadan. Many patients did not get the treatment that might have long-term future consequence on human capital. Potentially, there is a rebound on the utilization after the pandemic. And what's the main message from the two slides? About the financial sustainability, active membership decreased 5.4 million, mainly from the informal sector and the local government subsidized group. The support through the recovery budget not yet dispersed, means that 5.4 million people still uncovered by the health insurance system. Implication for the financial sustainability, in the short run, maybe there is no impact because of the reduced the utilization, but in the long run, there is expected rebound in utilization, but lower in revenues. This will be problematic for the long term of the social security system in Indonesia. And lastly, this is the last slide about the policy response. We make some notes from our presentation. Yes, the government focused on the safeguarding the economy, but without controlling infection rate, this might not be successful. So we have to clearly think about the controlling the infection rate. Recovery package is in place, but the implementation is slow. That's implementation is slow means that the low recovery process. But a strong focus on the boosting and consumption and poverty reduction. The existing program is not designed for pandemic, needs to expand the middle income, and needs more support for the private sector, for example, through the firm subsidies instead of the wage subsidies to the worker. The government should also look ahead beyond the social assistance and start addressing the potential long-term structural consequence of the crisis. This is from our presentation. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Robert and Teguh, and for your presentation. And thanks very much also to Renate, who is they're lurking in the background in case a question comes up that she can answer. So now we're over to Professor Hal Hill. Please, Hal, the floor is yours.
It still doesn't move. Okay. Which one? In here? Okay. Thanks very much and good afternoon, everybody. Good morning, selamat pagi. Good very early morning, Robert and Renate and others in Western Europe, and good evening, maybe somewhere as well. Thanks very much. Thanks very much for the invitation to participate. Congratulations to Blaine and Furman for putting on a great show, and to the mighty Indonesia project team. I want to just mention, for those of us of a certain age who were at the very first Indonesia update here at ANU in 1983, organised by Peter Macaulay, who's here with us physically, and the late Jamie Mackey. It was billed as a one-off experiment, small scale, about 50 or 60 people in a seminar room, and it's grown into this wonderful event. Selamat, terima kasih banyak, Bung, Peter. I can't thank Jamie except virtually, maybe. But it's a wonderful event and still going strong. It's fantastic. So my job is to really provide something of a sort of scene-setting overview for the riches that have already occurred today and will follow in the next 3 days. So I'm going to go broad rather than deep. I've got to thank a lot of people, too numerous to mention, but there are many colleagues and friends who've helped me in thinking about the issues, and also with some of the assistance with some of the statistics. So how do we think about the COVID crisis in general? Well, it's truly global. It was unanticipated. It's testing every aspect of government, from economics to health and much else. There are many unknowns. Its economic, social, political impacts, how and when it's going to end. There are large country variations, as we've already seen, and in particular, there's a big variation between rich and poor countries in their capacity to protect their citizenry and the enterprises and much else. It's also occurring at a time of deep global division and the struggle which the global community is having to undertake coordinated collective action at a time when it's really needed. What about for Indonesia? What can one say? Well, I think it's fair to say it's one of the most serious crises the Republic has faced, in some ways different from, but also on a par with the late 1940s, the mid-1960s and the late 1990s. The crisis has told us something about Indonesia, in fact, quite a bit about Indonesia. We've already heard of some of this story so far. It's revealed Indonesia's strengths, including, I think, its historic record of prudent macroeconomic management. It's by and large settled polity, and notwithstanding, as Greg rightly said, some of the reservations, and its advantage of location in the pragmatic, dynamic East Asian region. It's also tested some of Indonesia's potential vulnerabilities, its historic underinvestment in public health facilities, the limited fiscal space the government has had pre-COVID, the partial reliance on short-term foreign currency borrowings to finance budgets and current account deficits on occasion, the unfinished reform agenda between different tiers of government, national and local, and it's also the rather unsupportive global environment, notwithstanding the East Asian successes. Okay, so here's my summary somewhere. So here's my storyline in a sense. It's focused mainly on Indonesia, a bit on the prelude, the initial impacts, especially the macroeconomic impacts, government response, real economy, social impacts, and compared to last time, and of course last time for the serious crisis for Indonesia in the last 50 years was the Asian financial crisis, 97, 98. Then finally, time permitting, a bit on the lessons learned so far and the way forward. Remembering this is early days, we've got a long way to go in this crisis. The crisis, the story's already been told about the crisis. It's the most serious It's the most serious global economic crisis for 90 years and the most serious pandemic, of course, for a century. It spread very rapidly, and no sign of stabilizing globally, at least, and certainly in some large countries. There are very large country variations. Much of East Asia seems to be managing it better than the rest of the world, a point I'm going to come back to a bit later on, including even quite poor countries like Vietnam, which was alluded to in the previous presentation. It's also an unequal crisis, and we can see the inequality of the dimension in particular through this slide, which just shows that rich countries have a lot more fiscal and monetary firepower to support their citizens and their enterprises than poor countries. Just think about Indonesia. When a crisis occurs, we want to think about the pre-crisis vulnerability indicators, because that tends to affect the shape of the crisis and its outcomes. I think it's useful to see Indonesia in terms of the three key parameters: the economic conditions, the health system, and the general institutional capacity, government capacity. So we've already heard quite a lot about the economy from Robert, Teguh and Renate. We're going to hear, and also on the health system from them, we're going to hear a lot more about the health system from Firman and Mira. And we've heard quite a bit about the government's institutional political capacities already from Greg. It's worth just keeping in mind on the economy that Indonesia pre-crisis actually compared pretty well to quite a few other countries. For those of you with good eyesight, you can have a look at that graph. If you haven't got good eyesight, you can trust me since I'm an economist. So what this tells us basically is out of 66 developing countries on sort of pre-crisis macroeconomic vulnerability indicators, Indonesia ranked pretty well. It was ranked 16 out of 66, so in the top quarter of countries. So it's worth keeping that in mind, that pre-crisis Indonesia was relatively well prepared in a macroeconomic sense, albeit with limited fiscal space, a point I'm going to talk about in a bit more detail later, and fairly low debt, particularly fairly low public sector debt. So some fiscal space for the government, although constrained. On the health system, we're going to hear a lot more about it, so I'll skip it. And also the political system, just the obvious points that Indonesia has not invested extensively in its public health system, and testing rates and so on are lower. So those indicators are well known. When the crisis hit, as with most crises, the biggest hit occurred initially in financial markets, sort of maybe an arcane area which only economists are interested in, but it actually matters. Developing countries in crises typically have double hits. They have a hit in their financial markets themselves, their asset prices and so on, but they also typically have an additional hit, which is the exit of capital from their countries to so-called safe destinations. Ironically, the safe destinations are often where the COVID crisis is most serious, for example, at the moment in the United States. So when you think about Indonesia's economic managers, Dr. Sri Mulyani Indrawati and Dr. Peri Wadjo, they've got to manage this fast-moving double hit. Will it, for example, trigger a generalised run on their currencies? Memories of 97, 98 are still deeply etched in Indonesian policymakers' thinking when the rupiah went from 2,500 to 17,500 to the dollar. Will the crisis drain the domestic financial system of liquidity, possibly triggering a bank run back to 97, 98 again? Where there's quite a lot of foreign currency debt and the rupiah depreciates, will governments be able to fund their deficits? In fact, can the additional stimulus be funded? And in a polarised world, how effective so far have been international and regional safety nets? Short answer, no action there for Indonesia, at least. No mention of the IMF for reasons we can discuss later. So Indonesia got hit harder than most of its neighbours, and just choosing for comparison China, India, Philippines, and Thailand, a sort of sprinkling of middle-income economies. You can see the red line is for Indonesia's currency. It's not a red alert, although it might have been seen as such. The currency got hit hard quickly in March following the global meltdown. And you can see also the country risk, the country spread, the premium for borrowing to Indonesia also was higher than its neighbours. So in a sense, like it or not, unfortunately, there still is kind of country risk uncertainty or premium for Indonesia, which policymakers had to grapple with. So the positive news quickly was that, especially Bank Indonesia, the monetary authorities moved quickly in the wake of this financial market instability globally and Indonesia, and restored stability. We'll hear about this in more detail from Steve and Roland. And so with a measure of exchange rate and financial stability restored by around about April and May, Indonesia was then able to address some of the other economic challenges, in particular with fiscal policy. And as noted, Indonesia's public debt to GDP is low by international standards, so there was some room to move. Although the country's tax effort is rather weak, about 11% of GDP pre-crisis, and it's part funded through foreign currency borrowings, and there's quite a bit of off-budget debt, particularly state enterprises. So the government had quite a bit of fiscal firepower to throw at this crisis to protect its citizens beginning around April. Bank Indonesia had already indicated it would step in as a last resort buyer of bonds. There was a temporary relaxation of the 3% fiscal law deficit for the next 3 years, and some additional pledges, although not a lot actually, from international communities. The fiscal response packages was outlined in great detail just now by Teguh and Robert and Renate. Just a few comments on it, thinking standing back from the immediate crisis elements. A few points just to emphasise. First of all, Indonesia's fiscal stimulus package has been pretty small by comparison. Depends how you measure it, of course, but it has been a rather small one, and it's been mainly debt financed, which is what you'd expect. Could it have been larger? This is a central question to think about. Arguably, it could have been, but that's a complicated issue. Minister Sri Mulyani and the cabinet colleagues had to walk a fine line between ensuring stability and not making the market too jittery. In addition, again, as Teguh has pointed out, the expenditure release has been pretty slow. So it's been a small stimulus, and it's been one that's been fairly slow to respond. In fact, most of the stimulus, as far as I can determine, has really been what economists call automatic stabilisers, which is it's been driven by the collapse in tax revenue, and so that explains a lot of the increase. In some senses, this is not unlike the global financial crisis of 2008-9, where in the end the fiscal stimulus wasn't actually needed that much because the crisis wasn't very serious, but what it was actually rather small. Has the government introduced too many stimulus measures? Like all countries responding to many different constituencies, arguably it has, and that is probably one of the reasons for the slow turnout in expenditure again, and the variations across programs that Teguh mentioned with the social programs, the PKH and the Kartu Sembako, well established and spending more quickly. So the fiscal story is an evolving one, and it's quite a complicated one. On the economy, we've already got the story essentially from Robert and team, so not much more to add. I'm going to add just a little bit later when I compare this crisis so far to the previous crisis, 97-98. The national accounts story show the expected uneven impacts. Crises like this impact unevenly. As you'd expect, and as shown in the previous presentation, agriculture has been the most resilient. But remember, the agriculture sector now is quite a bit smaller than it was in 97-98. So the scope for agricultural resilience is somewhat less. Service sector, again, you get this highly variable impacts depending on movement of people as being a key determinant. On the expenditure side, the story is more or less as you'd expect, except there hasn't been much dis-saving or consumption smoothing. Consumption has fallen about as much as the economy as a whole. And then, as Robert mentioned, the puzzling feature so far has been that the government sector has shrunk about as much as the economy as a whole. In other words, Keynesian economics and fiscal stimulus measures haven't been operating as yet. At least they weren't until mid this year, because the figures we've got now only go through till the end of June. Subnational story, always important for Indonesia, given its huge diversity. And the story was already covered in a sense by previous speakers. The key point, I guess, to note is that the two provinces which are particularly dependent on the movement of people have been the most adversely affected, and that is Bali with tourism and Yogyakarta with education. And in addition, some of the regions off Java have been so far less adversely affected, and that's partly because they're a bit more isolated and protected by it, and partly because they're more agricultural. Social impacts, this has been covered again already, and we'll hear a lot more about it in detail from Vivi, from Chris Manning, from Budi and Milda, and Sharon and Anji. Just a few quick points. First of all, we don't yet have a clear picture of the social impacts because the usual data sources aren't yet available, so things like Susunas and Sakanas. But Indonesia at least has learnt from the crisis of 97 and 98 to build up analytical capacity and measurement capacity, which has actually helped managing the crisis. We expect that, we know that Indonesian households are concentrated around the median, and therefore even small movements in employment circumstances, income, food prices can actually have quite a big impact. And so we're going to, not surprisingly, get some impacts even if the economic decline isn't all that big, as our friend Asep Suryahadi has shown already in this pioneering early estimate. So a lot depends on what happens in the labour market. We'll hear about that from Chris, on food prices and availability, which Acho and Felipe will talk about, and crucially on how effective the government transfers have been, which we've heard a bit about already. Is the crisis going to be distributionally neutral? Not clear yet. Remember, the last crisis was actually hit higher income earners more than lower income earners. So the inequality, the Gini ratio actually fell. Not clear this time. One can develop priors either way. I'm running out of time, so just one more section, then a bit on looking forward. Compared to last time, well, if there's good news at the moment, the good news perhaps can be summarised in this graph, and that tells us what's been happening to the economy in the initial period of this crisis compared to the last serious crisis, 97, 98. The global financial crisis, which was in a sense a non-crisis for Indonesia, is in the middle. So far, at least, this crisis hasn't been as severe as the previous one. And the macroeconomic management has been, of course, much better. There hasn't been a collapse in the rupiah. The banking system hasn't collapsed, not yet at least. We don't really know what's underneath the surface in the banking system. But at least this time, it looks a little bit hopeful. The crisis hasn't been as deep and as quick as 97, 98. But it's early days. We don't know how this crisis is going to happen. It's going to take its course. The recovery is unlikely to be the V-shaped recovery which we saw after the Asian financial crisis, and that's partly because the global economy is so weak this time. Also, Indonesia is unlikely to be able to export its way out of the crisis, which to some extent it did in 97, 98 with the very weak rupiah and the strong global economy. And the strategy of agricultural resilience is probably going to be less important simply because the agriculture sector is smaller. Okay, in the remaining time, which isn't very much, just let me just highlight a few issues to think more broadly and lessons learned and the way forward. I just run through them very quickly, I think, because Blaine's going to tell me I'm almost out of time, right? So first lesson, go early and go hard when a crisis hits. So Indonesia's done that, certainly monetary policy, less so on fiscal policy. It probably, maybe, could have gone harder fiscally, could have had a larger and quicker fiscal stimulus, but that's a complex issue, which is no simple answer to. Secondly, then, once the crisis is nearing its end, hopefully sort of first half of next year, the second lesson is to restore public finances and economic policy quickly. That means getting back to the old fiscal law in some sense within the next couple of years. It means making sure that Bank Indonesia's independence is maintained. Some question about that at the moment. The so-called modern monetary theory, where just borrow and spend as much as you like, I'm not persuaded by for Indonesia. But there's a big debate about it, but not clear to me that it's actually all that helpful. Maybe useful for a country like America. I don't think it is for Indonesia. Third point, obviously, is to extend and expand the social safety net provisions. This was one of the responses from the Asian financial crisis, and it's going to be as relevant this time as last time. Better resourced and more and better targeting, although there's been a lot of progress. Fourth, obviously, again, is the public health system. Indonesia will, like most countries, will need to invest a lot more in the public health system. No quick fixes, of course. You can't just turn on a tap for public health system. Fifth, I think, as Acho and Felipe are going to remind us, stay open and maybe more open. There's a lot of money sloshing around in systems with the monetary and fiscal policy stimuluses. There's a lot of pressure. The anti-globalization movement is arguing economies need to close off significantly. Indonesia isn't a particularly open economy compared to its neighbours like Malaysia, Thailand, Singapore. And it's missed out on some of the benefits of globalization. So there will be pressure for what might be called strategic import substitution, some of it warranted, for example, pharmaceutical products, health system products and other things. But I think it's important to have a clear analytical framework to evaluate the pressing demands that are going to be in this area. Sixth is obviously preparing for this accelerating IT-driven world, so telehealth, teleeducation, telecommuting, and in a way the most important policy here is to have a strong, inclusive, efficient IT system. Final 2 points. Indonesia, since we've got such global discord, Indonesia can certainly play a role, as I think Ambassador Gary Quinlan mentioned, with its neighbours in trying to restore some semblance of cohesive, concerted global action in a divided world. This is where perhaps East Asia can lead the way, because East Asia's benefited so much from this open, rules-based economy, and it stands to lose a lot. And East Asia now has such importance in the global economy that Indonesia with East Asia and Australia and countries like-minded can actually do something, hopefully. Finally, and pleased to see that Greg emphasised this as well from what Pat Jacobi has said, never waste a crisis. Crises are both challenges but also opportunities. As the late Professor Muhammad Sadli said, in Indonesia, bad times often make good policies. ? Will they this time? It can go either way. Not clear yet which way policy is going, whether there's going to be the sort of reform that governments can do when they're emboldened by a challenge, whether the reforms, and I've mentioned some of them as an agenda, or whether the policy will go the other way. But at least there's an opportunity as well as a challenge from a crisis. Thank you very much, and I do look forward to comments and questions. Terima kasih.
Okay, thank you very much, Al. Appreciate that. We're going to start the question and answer period. Now we have about, 30 minutes or so for questions and answers. Again, please try to keep your questions short and also your responses. So we'll start off with 3 questions. I'm going to read a couple of them, and then some will pose their questions directly. The first question is from our friend and colleague at the Jakarta Post, Andy Bayuni. This is for Greg. If repressive pluralism is gaining ground and is pushing back Islamism, how do you explain the deepening of religious conservatism at the same time? The second question is from Selen Valencia at UPN Jawa Timur. She's going to ask her question directly. So if we can unmute her here. Sorry. Maybe we'll come back to that when we have a little bit of technical difficulty. So the third question on our list here, also for Greg, from Jared M. This is via YouTube. Would you say the invocation of gotong royong is consistent with the historical trend of mobilizing gotong royong for political purposes? So maybe we can get answers to those first two questions from Greg first, and then we'll see whether we can connect with Selen.
Okay, I can be heard. Okay, good. So thank you to the two questioners, Andy Bayuni, first of all. In a way, we're talking about two different things. On the one, as you say, there is rising Islamic conservatism in Indonesia, and I think that's a religious and sociological phenomenon, and that's happening in many countries, not just in Indonesia. But the question is whether it is the role of the state to intervene to try to change that, particularly in a democratic state, and whether the state should be discriminating against people who have increasingly conservative views. So I think that's a problem. That's the issue for someone, for a government to decide, is where the boundaries lie in appropriate intervention in these matters. As I mentioned, I think this runs a risk of social engineering. And I think in actual fact, it is extremely difficult for a state to engineer someone's religious beliefs. So at the moment, what they're doing is providing a wide range of disincentives for people to become more Islamist. If they're not doing anything that threatens the state or threatens good order in society or breaks the laws, well then why should the state be intervening in those matters? These trends of political conservatism, they rise and fall. We know that even if just looking over the last century. But these are genuine organic things within society. And sometimes when states interfere, they can make matters much worse. They can have a radicalising effect on people. That may be one outcome that we see in this case. If you're a law-abiding PKS academic or public servant, and you get called in and you are told that your political affiliations are unacceptable to us and you will have no career advancement unless you leave that party, well then what will those people do? There's often very smart people. They've made a very considered decision, and okay, they might become less obviously active, but it doesn't necessarily mean to say they've changed their views. There's a reason why they joined that party in the first place. No one's forcing them to. And this is what people should be given the freedom to do in democracy. If the state has a problem with it, well, then the state should come up for reasons why it has to regulate or pass laws against it. So I would be cautioning against excessive religious intervention by the state. The second question from Gerard M. about the invocation of gotong royong. I think for a lot, many Indonesians, of course, are familiar with the term. If we went back in a time capsule to the late 1950s, early 1960s, gotong royong was something often heard, often discussed. Sukarno himself often expounded on the theme. But most Indonesians these days don't give it a great deal of thought. Okay, mutual cooperation, something for the collective benefit of the state, that's a good thing to engage in, nothing wrong with it. The risk here is that many people in that community of increasingly conservative Muslims, many people in that community come to see this kind of Pancasila formulation as something which is anti-Islam. And that would mean ipso facto that they would be inclined to reject it. And so that's why this attempted bill about Pancasila ideological guidelines runs the risk of being counterproductive, because it makes Muslims think there's something hostile in an interpretation of Pancasila. So that's why I think this is a bill really formulated by PDIP members who have their heads seriously in Sukarnoist ideology, and hardly anyone outside the party cares about all that stuff. It's okay that they do. That's all part of the rich mosaic of Indonesian democracy. But they shouldn't expect that too many other people are going to suddenly embrace this. Pancasila is often a rather dry thing compared to a religion, and I think that this is bound to fail, and indeed it has failed.
Okay, thanks for that, Greg. We're going to turn to a new round of questions. The first one is from our friend Puspa Amri, all the way from Sonoma State in California. She's going to go ahead and ask her question directly, presuming we can connect to her directly. Okay.
Hello. Hi, Blaine. Hello. I'm assuming I can be heard okay? All right. So my question is for Professor Hal Hill. Thank you for pointing out that Indonesia's fiscal policy is actually relatively small in size to other countries. However, there is already concerns about the ability to finance this budget deficit, which is expected to double. I wanted to know if you could elaborate a little bit more on what your thoughts are of the long-term implications of Bank Indonesia currently monetizing the government's deficit. In fact, do you think that Bank Indonesia should revise its current mandate and have one that's more concerned with both inflation and employment, as the newest draft bill that was being discussed last week in the DPR suggests? Thank you.
All right, I'll read off a couple of extra questions while Hal is pondering the answer to that question. No, I'll go ahead and ask a couple more. We'll take 3 at a time. The second one is from Darenda Wardhana from Bapanas. This is either for Robert or for Hal. The question is, when this pandemic is over, is returning to the inefficient old normal a wise step to revise the economy? The second question is from Cyril Firmancia at the Universitas Pajajaran, also for Hal or for Robert. What is your opinion regarding Indonesia's government policy to allow Bank Indonesia to buy government bonds in the primary market? So those are the 3 questions. You guys can sort it out. Who you would like to, Hal, maybe you give it a shot first, and then when you can turn it over to Robert and friends.
Okay, so the real wisdom will come from Amsterdam and Germany and Jakarta, of course, later. But just to have a quick first run at them. So Puspa, hi, hello. What time is it over there? It must be quite late. So thanks for the question. So this is a balancing act, isn't it? How you run a fiscal stimulus in a crisis. On the one hand, you want to throw as much as you can at it. On the other hand, you don't want to seriously jeopardize sort of country perceptions of risk and so on. So you've got to walk a fine line, which Indonesia is currently doing. I think if you look comparatively, the fiscal stimulus is very small, and of course it's even smaller in practice so far because of the slow disbursements. And arguably, it could have been larger and could have been quicker. That's easy to say from the comfort of a Canberra armchair, and it's much more difficult to do it from Indonesia. But that's just a general observation, and no doubt in a crisis you learn from it, and the government will learn how to do the fiscal stimulus a bit larger for the inevitable next time. It's just worth keeping in mind that, as I mentioned, Indonesia's public debt, when it does give it quite a lot of scope for an expanded stimulus. Of course, richer countries are, in a sense, in a more comfortable position. they can expand in some cases more easily. But it's just worth keeping in mind that the stimulus, even after the crisis, Indonesia will not be a heavily indebted country. So as far as Bank Indonesia is concerned, and this really goes to the third question also from our friend in UNPAD, in a crisis, you do everything as much as you can, as quick as you can. It seems to me it made sense for Bank Indonesia to break with, in a sense, its orthodoxy and actually step into the market and offer to be a last resort buyer. My understanding is it's actually bought very few bonds so far, maybe none at all, I'm not sure, but very small number. And so most of the bond buying has been looking at the figures. To the extent I understand all the fine print, is that foreigners deserted the market for Indonesian government securities and domestic banks stepped in, partly because there were relaxed liquidity requirements for the domestic banks, partly also because government bonds were actually one of the best things to buy when you wanted to have security. And partly, of course, because the big three, the big four are government owned, so perhaps there was a bit of general pressure on them. Should Bank Indonesia's mandate be revised? I think we've got to be very careful here. The lesson from the bad old days of governments leaning on central banks was don't do it. Central banks become politicised. Seems to me that since 1999, when Bank Indonesia was made independent, it's actually performed very effectively. It's got a floating rate regime, and it's got inflation targeting. In principle, the government could add a kind of economic responsibility to it, as of course other central banks do have, and some sort of growth or some sort of employment objectives. So nothing wrong with that in principle, providing the full professional independence of Bank Indonesia is maintained. And I think that's the key issue at the moment with the bill before Parliament. We'll hear more about this tomorrow, by the way, from Steve Grenville, I think. So that really covers, I think, the first and the third. The second question, I'm sorry I didn't catch the questioner's name, but I think the reference was, will Indonesia go back to the old normal of inefficient growth? So let's just keep in mind the fact that Indonesia hasn't been growing particularly fast for the last 20 years. It's been growing at about 5% a year. But 5% in this current environment, it could be better. It could be the sort of 6.5s and 7s of Vietnam and sometimes India and China and even the Philippines, but it's actually not bad. So I wouldn't be too tough on Indonesia's economic performance over the past 20 years. Sure, lots of reform, and lots of reform could actually lead to faster growth, but 5% isn't too bad. So the old normal, isn't too bad, but it could be better. Thank you. So let me pass over to Robert and Renate and Teguh, I think, because they might want to say something too. Thank you.
Yeah, so maybe I'm going to take on the second question and just add a little bit, because I think we agree Steve Grenville tomorrow will be probably the expert and give you much more details on the current situation with the central bank and the bill before Parliament. So I think from a lot of the things that we've seen and heard, also from experts and talking to experts in Indonesia, is also that there is this hope that there is going to be a push for digitalization and improving a lot of processes within companies, particularly, for example, within the hotel industry, where we see that hotel managers are more and more concerned with employing people in the future that are more generalist, more tech savvy, and so on and so forth. So maybe some of these inefficiencies in terms of work processes will be leveled out. And I think there's indications towards that. But whether we're going to see sort of the return to the old normal, I think not precisely, not clearly, not entirely. So I think some of the things will stick around, but to what extent this will play out and to what extent that will then play out in growth, that's something where we're not yet placed to make an informed judgment.
Robert or Teguh? Sorry, Robert or Teguh, would you like to weigh in on any of those? Otherwise, we'll go to maybe a last quick final round of questions.
Well, I think Hal already gave a pretty comprehensive answer to the first and the third, which I guess are related. Since I'm not an expert on monetary policy, I'd be careful answering that. But the Bank of Indonesia buying up bonds now, I think if it's just a one-off, and very quick answer, if it's just a one-off, and in the current situation, I don't think this is very dangerous. I believe inflation is still very low at the moment, so I don't see there would be a big risk. But yeah, I'll leave that to maybe Stephen tomorrow, digging into that a bit deeper. Yeah.
Okay, let me ask three final questions. The responses are going to have to be very short, perhaps a word or two. One from Wahyu Susilo. This is either to Teguh or to Hal. Is universal basic income a good option for social protection scheme? That's a one word, that's a thumbs up or a thumbs down. Second one from Ross Taylor. Should Indonesia accelerate government's expenditure to support the economy? And then the final question is for Greg from Riandi Laksono. He's a PhD student here at ANU. Is securitization inevitable regardless of who the president is? The role of armed forces has been increasingly strong even under SBA. So three final questions and answers, please.
So, do you want me to go first, mate? Okay, so can I have 1 minute, not one word? I should have mentioned, by the way, on all this fiscal policy stuff, we're going to hear much more authority, I think it's tomorrow, from Masjida and Rahman. I'm sorry, I should have mentioned that already. A universal basic income, well, I'll be interested to hear what Teguh says. I think good in principle, but not practical at all. Indonesia's fiscal space is so limited, and you want to target as much as you can. And my impression is that Indonesia has been able to target quite a bit. And of course, targeting is very difficult, as we know. So I would hesitate, I would argue caution on that one. To Ross, yeah, I think the Indonesian community demands a lot more of government than its tax base is so far able to fund. When you've got a tax to GDP ratio of about 11% of GDP, and you've got a middle class, a middle income economy with demanding a lot of services across education, health, infrastructure, and defence, and much else. I think you need a larger government sector, but you've got to fund it somehow. And that's perhaps been the missing element in the past 20 years, the difficulty of getting really big and major tax reform, which can be both equitable and efficient in the process. So yes, in principle, but question is how to fund it. Just one final point. Since we're talking about a crisis, we haven't heard anything about the International Monetary Fund, which is supposed to be the funder of last resort in crisis times. And in a way, that tells us something about Indonesian economic and political history, and the fact that the international system isn't working all that effectively. Same applies, by the way, to the regional financial safety net, a thing called the Enhanced Chiang Mai Initiative. These global and regional initiatives aren't present when they're needed.
And in answer to Riandi Laksono's question, I actually have some sympathy with Jokowi. You can see he's trying to get this problem under control quickly. And if I had some of the ministers in my cabinet that Jokowi has in his cabinet, he appointed them, of course, but some of them he did so with an arm behind his back, I would also be searching for other alternatives. So I have some sympathy for that. Nonetheless, I think it's not inevitable that we get securitization. SBY was actually quite good at limiting the military's involvement in social affairs. He allowed them some scope for counterterrorism and a few other things, but you could tell he was reluctant to do so. And I think that's a wise thing in a democracy like Indonesia. What you want to do is to develop civilian capacity. And if your solution is always to roll out the TNI, or use intelligence service or something like that, well then you're finding a shortcut. You're avoiding the big problem, which is the unresponsiveness the inertia that is present in the ministries and bureaucracies and the like. So that's a problem Jokowi really wants to fix. And rolling out the military in the longer term can lead to more problems than it solves.
Teguh, you want to weigh in on that question, the previous one?
Okay, related to the universal basic income, I agree with the Prof. Hal. This is theoretically is very, very nice because it will solve about the exclusion and inclusion error in distributing the social assistance. Yeah, many studies, one studies in Africa also by Banerjee et al. Mentioned that universal basic income is good. But looking at the Indonesian's condition, the fiscal space, I think I can say that this is not feasible from the current fiscal condition of Indonesia. That's it.
Any other questions?
Oh, if Kartika wants to ask you a question.
Okay, Kartika, if you want to raise your hand, somebody will locate you among the hundreds of participants, so we promise, and unmute you.
Okay.
Got it?
Okay, thank you for the opportunity. My name is Kartika from Brawijaya University, East Java, Indonesia. Thank you, Anu, for creating this kind of events, because this is really important. It's really for me, because now I'm holding for the COVID-19 in my university. So first, my question is will be the safety net sent to the society until the COVID-19 in Indonesia ended? If yes, how to deliver it to the society, because our GDP is slowing down? And then the second question, remains to the Robert Sparrow, I think. How to make flexible and properly managed in our fiscal right now, because this is really like a quite challenging for Indonesia to manage the fiscal things. Thank you.
So Robert, that's you on the hot seat, I believe, for that question.
Okay. So I didn't hear that. What was the question? It was about fiscal policy.
Yes, it's a very simple question: how to manage fiscal policy well and easily.
Okay. Well, I might have to pass that one to Hal or to Teguh. I'm not a fiscal policy expert, and I would. One thing I could say, I don't see how you can manage it easily these days, right? I don't think that's possible. But I would have to pass this one on perhaps to Teguh. I don't know if he has any thoughts on this. But there will be a presentation. When is it? Tomorrow? I think Hal just referred to that, right? Tomorrow on the fiscal policy. They'll go into this in more detail. But it will not be easy. No.
Teguh, do you want to say anything about that, managing fiscal policy?
I think the answer is SMS with the Robert. Maybe tomorrow we'll have the specific answer about this, because the presenter will be from the Fiscal Policy Office or Ministry of Finance. But actually, look at the fiscal space of Indonesia. I think it's very hard. There is not many room for expanding the fiscal policy, because our focus is more on spending, but the problem is also on the revenue side in the case of Indonesia. Maybe tomorrow will be the next presenter. Tomorrow will be clear answer about this managing on the fiscal policy, but it's very, very hard in the current situation.
Including Blaine and Ruth. I forgot to mention Blaine and Ruth also.
Yeah. I'm going to also fob that off on somebody else. All right, thanks very much. I want to just say one more round of quick thank yous and then advise you of the schedule tomorrow before we sign off. I'd like to thank the Vice-Chancellor of ANU, Brian Schmidt, and Ambassador Gary Quinlan for joining us and opening up the session. And then to Greg, Robert, Teguh, and Renate, along with Hal for their presentations today. I think it was an excellent round of presentations. And to all of you who have asked questions, thanks very much. Tomorrow we kick off at the same time, 1 p.m., 10 a.m. Waktu Indonesia Barat. And tomorrow the topic of the session is money and finance, double whammy. And we're lucky to have with us tomorrow former Minister of Finance, Dede, who will open up the conference, and then some presentations from Stephen Grenville and co-author, and Masita from the Ministry of Finance, along with yours truly and my co-author, Ruth Nikajulu.